Welcome. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Russell Orr. I'm the Vice President of Staff Education Development for EXOS, and I want to walk through a conversation today on global movement themes and the building blocks to sport. And I want to talk a little bit about where this conversation or where this presentation comes from, the background. If we start to look at my background in professional baseball and in collegiate baseball as a athletic trainer and strength and conditioning professional, I spent many years working with pitching coaches and hitting coaches and built some friendships and relationships that lasted over the years. And so we have conversations up until this point, and they'll reach out to me. We'll talk about pitching mechanics, and we'll talk about something that they're seeing in pitching mechanics and how we're going to fix it or how can they fix it. And what's interesting is we have two different viewpoints. The pitching coach looks at the pitching flaw or mechanical flaw and says, how can I fix it with a drill? Or how can I fix it with a verbal cue? And you'll see plenty of pitching coaches with lots of different drills that they'll take their athletes through, or lots of different verbal commands to tell them to stay back or reach for the mitt or don't fly open or whatever the coaching cue is to ultimately try to correct that mechanical flaw. And sometimes they have success and sometimes they wrestle with it, and that's coaching. But inside of it, when I look at it, I say the people that can't do what you're asking them don't have the mechanical prerequisites to get there. They physically can't do what you're asking them to do. Either they're lacking mobility of certain areas of their body, they're lacking stability, they're lacking the ability to pattern what you're looking for, they lack rotational ability to decel or excel the body. And so I look at it as a performance coach or a strength coach, and I look at it and say, there's something dysfunctional here. I want to build a better mousetrap. I want to build a better robot. And so inside that, I'm going to look at the body and say, well, the coach says, this is what I'm seeing in the bullpen. This is what I'm seeing in the game. And I want to take the body and break it down into the joint by joint. What do they need to be able to get in that position? And then what do they need neuromuscularly to get in that position? And then what kind of power output do they need, or rotational power do they need to produce? And so I want to go back and rework that and build that with this pitcher. And so in this conversation, sometimes the pitching coach would have a drill, and sometimes we'd have to develop a plan to work that athlete through to work on mobility and stability and some power to be able to replicate what they're looking for in the bullpen session. And inside there, our two worlds collide, because sometimes the pitching coach doesn't know when to reach out to me, or doesn't know when to reach out to the strength and conditioning or the performance specialist. And so in this presentation, I want to look at human movement. I want to talk about how the body moves. I want to talk about how the body moves in certain situations when you're pitching or hitting. I also want to look at kind of exposing the pitching coach or exposing the professional to look at what could be going wrong with the body, and how do I then troubleshoot it. And so I want to create kind of a system to troubleshooting some of those movement deficiencies you might find in a pitcher. So that's where we start today. Is we start in these four sections that we want to cover. And section number one is we have to get on the same page. We have to be talking about the same thing. And so when we start talking about it, I want to introduce human movement in the terms of the global movement theme. I want to talk about flexion and rotation and extension rotation. And if I just pause for a second and everybody close their eyes and I said, imagine flexion rotation, imagine extension rotation. All of you would have millions of different ideas going through your head. And that's exactly why we need to get on the same page. That's exactly why we need to get to the point where I'm going to introduce what flexion rotation is to me. You'll start to see it. We'll start to talk about it. You'll start to understand my language, my viewpoint. And then I'll talk about extension rotation, and we'll look at that. But then we have to connect the dots. So taking human movement and then applying it inside of sport, and in this example, the sport is going to be pitching and hitting or baseball. And so we want to spend some time looking at how the global movement themes show up inside of pitching and hitting. And so looking at the flexion rotation for a pitcher and extension rotation for a pitcher, so we can then build a better mousetrap. Number three, we have to then assess or analyze movement and talk about our mindset towards this. How do we look at movement? How do we know when that pitcher is lacking some movement prerequisites that's going to allow them to perform in their bullpen or on the mound? So we'll look at that briefly, and then we'll get into section 4. Section 4 is a library of resources for you. It is an introduction to a general structure for correcting movement dysfunction. It's going to take you through our framework of position, pattern, power. It's going to take you through how do you take somebody and look at these joint range of motion prerequisites. How do you then start to work on some soft tissue mobility across each individual joint that's then going to work together inside of a pattern, which then is going to work inside of some type of replication of power that would be delivering the baseball or striking the baseball. So these are the 4 sections. I'm ready to dive in. Let's go. Let's get started. So let's look at first the movement themes. The global movement themes, sometimes we'll call them as GMTs, but looking at these 2 athletes, on the left, female runner, weekend warrior, endurance athlete. Athlete on the right, 21-year-old NFL combine athlete, NFL prospect preparing for the combine, football player. You start to look at these 2 sports, couldn't be any different. Anaerobic power versus, aerobic and anaerobic threshold. You talk about one being more upright, one being played in more aggressive angles and positions. You start to look at that. But this conversation is not about sport. This conversation is about human movement. So we want to look at these 2 athletes and first talk about what is common inside of human movement across these 2 individuals. So if we look at the athlete on the left, this runner, we talk about first flexion. Her front side, her left leg is going through a flexion pattern. Her left ankle is going through dorsiflexion. Her knee is flexed and her hip is flexed and internally rotated. So we'll talk about that pattern. We'll see how it represents here and represents in a minute on the combine athlete. We'll also look at extension. So her right leg is extended. You have plantar flexion at the ground. You have knee extension, and you have right hip extension, external rotation at the hip. These 2 patterns are the 2 patterns that allow her to run up the stairs or ascend the stairs. The third thing that we're looking at is rotation. And we start to look at the slings of the body. We start to look at how the body works. And we start to look at, as the left knee comes up, her right shoulder rotates, or her sternum rotates towards her front side, towards her leg that's in triple flexion. That rotational error is showing that or representing her right side of her body turning towards her left leg. We will sometimes call this rotation left, okay? Or we'll call it contralateral rotation because she's moving towards the opposite side. Inside here, those 3 patterns take place inside of this movement and it reciprocates. So the next step she takes, her left leg will go into extension, her right leg will go into triple flexion, and she'll rotate back to instead of to the left, she'll rotate to the right. Look at this combine athlete. We start to look at flexion. The arrow's on his right leg. He's in triple flexion, dorsiflexion his ankle, knee flexion, hip flexion, internal rotation. His left leg is in triple extension, plantar flexion, knee extension, and his left hip is in extension, external rotation. And then we look at rotation. His arrow is going in the opposite direction because his left shoulder is now moving towards his right knee, or contralateral rotation, or rotation right. So the female, rotation left, male right here is rotation right. So he started, his sternum is turning to the right. And so that gives us some directionality. That is key because if you thought about just a pitcher inside of, let's say, a left-handed pitcher, as they stand on their post leg and start to load, the directionality of their sternum at one point is going to be towards their left leg, and then it's going to move away from their left leg. And we'll see that in just a second. So let's look at the body joint by joint, what's taking place for extension and rotation. So we talked about plantar flexion. We talked about toe off. So if you're a pitcher and you're pushing off the rubber, this is the last moment that your foot leaves the rubber and you toe off the rubber to deliver the baseball. You have extension, and we know that you have to drive towards home plate. You have to create force. So if this gentleman was a right-handed pitcher, his right knee would be going to extension as he's driving his left side towards home to be able to deliver the baseball. His right hip will go into extension, external rotation, which is the movement of the actual femur inside of the hip joint. The torso is going in contralateral rotation. Remember, his right leg here is extended. It's pushing. It is pushing away. It's the straight leg. It's the one that's helping you ascend the stairs, right? His left leg would actually be up in the air in triple flexion. So understand that I said that you have contralateral rotation. So this gentleman, his right shoulder would move towards his left hip, which would be contralateral rotation. The right arm would be in flexion external rotation. So understand that if his right leg is extended, running up the stairs, we move in opposition. So when one leg is up, the opposite arm is up, right? So at this point, the right arm is up. It is flexed, and if we went overhead, we go into external rotation. So it's flexion, external rotation. And the final piece is the neck, extension, rotation. And one caveat there is when my shoulders are moving contralateral, your neck moves in the opposite direction. That's for another conversation, another presentation, another time. But ultimately, understand how the body rotates right to left to create slings to move more efficiently and effectively or more powerfully in life or in sport. So let's look at the opposite side. Let's start to look at flexion rotation. And we want to look at two concepts, open chain and closed chain. So if we look at the runner on the left and we start talking about open chain, we start to see this body that's out in space, right? So she is loading the left leg. She's dorsiflexion, flexing the knee, flexing internal rotation of her hip. She's lifting in order to drive down in the ground. Let's go and talk about closed chain. Now, this image is not exactly right for closed chain because closed chain means the foot is on the ground, right? The foot is on the ground. So when this athlete's lead leg touches the ground, that becomes closed chain. And when that happens, just for an instant, he goes through a flexion pattern. He absorbs forces. So think landing, right? If I were to step off a box and land, I'm going to absorb force. It's going to be closed chain, and I'm going to go into triple flexion. What does that look like from a joint-by-joint approach? Well, in order to land or to do triple flexion, we need dorsiflexion. So that ankle has to go up, right? It has to absorb forces as you land on the ground. The knee will flex. The hip will flex and internally rotate. So as that femur comes up, the femur, as it moves inside the pelvis, it is flexing and internally rotating. Understanding now that the torso is going to have ipsilateral rotation. It's going to be moving towards the same side that is in flexion. Remember that the right side, the right shoulder in this picture, if the left knee is up, the right shoulder is moving towards the left leg. So that means that the left side of the body is moving towards the left side, which is in flexion. That is ipsilateral rotation. We then have extension, internal rotation. So this arm is going to be back by the body like running, and it's in extension. And if I were to continue through, that would be internal rotation. So we have on the right side, flexion, external rotation. On the left side, we have extension, internal rotation. And then going back to the neck, we have flexion and rotation, which looking at how the body moves, we're going to be swiveling in the opposite direction that your shoulders are going to keep your head in the middle. We'll look at that and we'll see how the body moves in space in some other examples. So here's an athlete running down the turf, and we start to look at the body, right? This is it in totality now, upright position. We look at the right side, dorsiflexion at the ankle, knee flexion, right hip flexion, internal rotation, okay? Right side of his body is ipsilateral rotation. It's moving towards that front leg. His right arm is an extension, internal rotation. If we go to the left side of his body, his foot is at plantar flexion, or yes, his knee is extension, his left hip is extension, external rotation. The left side of his torso is in contralateral rotation. So we could call this rotation right, or the directionality of his sternum is turning right. And then his left arm is in flexion, external rotation. So understanding these are just another example of somebody moving in these same global movement theme patterns. We now start to look at the same endurance athlete running up the stairs in a little bit more of an open air view, so you can kind of see a little bit better. And you start to say the same things taking place here, okay? Left leg, looking at the extension pattern, extension, plantar flexion. Then you have knee extension, have the hip extension, external rotation, and then understanding that the torso is going to be rotating right or contralateral rotation, and then the shoulder is flexion, external rotation. And then we go over to the right side, we have dorsiflexion, knee flexion, hip flexion, internal rotation. The torso is moving towards that side, so it's ipsilateral rotation or rotation right, so I could just say rotation right. And then the right arm is in extension, internal rotation. And these are the movement patterns that the body goes through. And understand that we're showing running here, but we could also start to look at, now let's look at the absorption of force. Because understanding this is kind of clean, the body reciprocates between the flexion extension pattern. So at one time the body's in flexion, the opposite side of the extension, and then they just trade places. And then they trade places, and they trade places, and you move forward. But here's a good closed chain example, okay? This athlete is his foot's in contact with the ground, and he is not landing, he's actually running, but his foot for just a second is in the flexion rotation pattern. And then he's going to translate out of it and move towards the extension rotation pattern. That's called propulsion. So inside of when he lands, let's call that absorption or loading. And then when you start to extend and you start to move forward, let's call that propulsion. So in extension rotation, we're going to propulse. In flexion rotation, we're going to absorb. So if we look at this athlete here, he's in flexion rotation, he's absorbing forces, where his ankle is dorsiflexed, his knee is flexed, his right hip is flexed, internally rotated. He has, his sternum is turning, the directionality is to the right. He is right rotation. And then you look at his arms, one is extension, one is in flexion. And so now we say he's going to immediately change from flexion rotation to extension rotation because he wants to move forward. He's not stopping. He just for a second is absorbing forces. Now he's going to turn those forces around and move down the field. So immediately that foot, the right leg, is going to go towards plantar extension or plantar flexion, knee extension, hip extension, external rotation. His sternum is going to turn and his arms are going to trade positions. This allows his left leg to now move through and assume the flexion rotation pattern. Understanding that this just is reciprocal. It goes back and forth, and you're trading places from right to left as you move down the field. But this is a normal movement pattern. I told you this is human movement. We're looking at it inside of sport. We're looking at it inside of the endurance athlete. We're looking at it inside of the football combine athlete. But what about just picking up a package off your stoop? This gentleman right here is absorbing forces. He's in the flexion rotation pattern on his right side. His right foot is dorsiflexed. His right knee is flexed. His right hip is flexed, internally rotated. His sternum is turned towards his right knee or his right hip. And he's now having to rotate to then go pick up that package. It's the global movement theme of flexion rotation, right? If this man lacks some type of range of motion, which I believe looking at him, he lacks a little bit of range of motion because of his rounded back and his very vertical shin angle, then ultimately we would want to be able to allow him to decel a little bit better. Maybe he's got some ankle mobility issues. Maybe he's got some hip or back mobility. I don't know by looking at this picture, but knowing me, I want to tinker. I want to build a better robot. So I would start to look and figure out what might be dysfunctional in his flexion rotation pattern to allow him to be more efficient or effective at picking up packages off the stoop. Now, he still has a big smile on his face, so he's not in too much pain, but I still see some dysfunction there. So what about inside of training, right? So we looked at kind of the upright runner and the sport and acceleration, but then what about training? So med ball. Let's look at med ball and look at this drill where we're doing a perpendicular med ball toss, a common drill that we use inside of our facilities. And looking at the left leg of this athlete here, the foot is in dorsiflexion, the knee is flexed, the hip is flexed and internally rotated. Her sternum is turned to the left, contralateral rotation. Now, her right hip, yes, it's flexed, but it's also externally rotated because the pelvis has turned towards its left leg, which would cause the right hip to be slightly in extension, external rotation. And that's key. That's key when we start to look at hitting, we start to look at pitching, we start to look at some of these things. You have to be able to transfer your forces. So inside here, this athlete in the arms, look at the arms. The right arm is flexed and externally rotated, and the left arm is extended internally rotated. And then we go and provide force. So going back to the absorption of force and the propulsion of force. So now you've pushed through that left leg. Now you have plantar flexion at the ground. You have knee extension. You have hip extension, external rotation. Your sternum is now moving towards the flex leg, which is now your lead leg, your right leg. And so the directionality is to the right, right? Contralateral rotation, right? And then you start to look at the shoulders as they start to progress. Now, the right leg, we can look at the right leg for just a second, and we start to look at that leg had to go into internal rotation, right? Because it's flexion. Internal rotation is a way to decel forces and to absorb forces. And so now all of a sudden the directionality is to the right with triple flexion. So she's in the right leg, her knee is extended, but her right hip is internally rotated and her hip is flexed, which is part of the flexion rotation pattern. So when you start to look at human movement, we start to look at it requires the dynamic integration of alternating and simultaneous expression of the global movement themes of flexion rotation and extension rotation. Understand that they work back and forth. They work in concert. So at one point, your leg is in extension, the other leg is in flexion. We then just switch places to then propulse. The foot comes in contact with the ground. Immediately when it comes in contact with the ground, it's got to absorb force, triple flexion, and then it's got to create force. It goes into triple extension, and you trade places as the other leg does the exact same thing, but in opposite. Now, if we look at human movement, we start to agree that there's these flexion rotation patterns, extension rotation patterns that show up all throughout the things that we do. So how would it then look if we start to talk about how it plays inside of baseball, or what I'll call symphonic sequencing? And why I call it symphonic sequencing is we understand that a symphony is how everything is blended together, how beautifully it sounds, how the orchestra sounds is when all the instruments are playing in harmony and together. When one instrument's out of tune, the whole entire orchestra changes. The tune of the orchestra, the harmony, you're now no longer harmonic. The body's the same way. Each single joint, from the ankle to the knee to the hip to the torso to the shoulder girdle, has to express its certain pattern at the right time, to be in the right place, to perform the right movement pattern, to be in harmony. And if one of those joints, ankle, knee, hip, torso, shoulder girdle, even your neck, doesn't do its job, it's going to ultimately break up the harmony of the movement pattern. And now all of a sudden you'll no longer be in sequence. And when you're no longer in sequence, that's when you're now going to see a pitching flaw, or you're going to see a mechanical flaw. Either it can be in running, it can be in shooting, basketball, whatever sport you're looking at. We're talking about baseball today, but understanding that we need all these things to work in concert. We'll talk about the specific demands of each joint later on, but understand that movement is less the sound of a single violin and more the symphony of the whole orchestra, right? And that's what I'm trying to say here. We're not just trying to train the knee. We're not just trying to train the hip. We're not just trying to train the shoulder girdle. We're trying to train the entire orchestra of the percussion and the woodwinds and the strings and everything to come together as one to create beautiful harmony. So if we look at pitching for a second, okay, we're going to start to look at what's taking place in the body. Now, in this picture, I'm not trying to sell whatever product that was, and I'm not trying to sell what he's standing on. I just took this picture because it happens to be a nice picture of what I'm looking for inside of the global movement themes. So if we start to look at one leg right now as an extension, and the other leg is in triple flexion. Now, inside there, we got to create force somewhere. And remember that we need to absorb force before we can create force. So what does that right leg have to do in order to create force? We're going to have to load that back leg, that stance leg, that post leg. It's got to load. The knee's got to bend, the hips got to bend. I got to be able to coil around that stance leg. Now, there are some prerequisites that I have to get there based on my ankle, my knee, my hip, my torso. We'll talk about those as a joint-by-joint approach in just a second. But right now, we start to look at In drive phase, this pitcher has now gone into triple flexion on the right leg and started to go into extension. Remember, they happen in reciprocity, right? One has to happen before the other, but once one happens, it immediately turns around and goes in the opposite direction. So in this picture, this pitcher is now working in the extension rotation pattern. The right leg is going into plantar flexion. The knee is starting to extend. The hip is starting to extend and externally rotate to drive the body towards home plate. Now, in pitching, one thing that's going to be interesting is the left leg is also going to have to work in extension as well. Why? Okay. The pitching, the lead leg, the land leg, has to go into extension and external rotation so then I can absorb forces or decelerate to deliver the baseball. Remember, I'm not going right, left, right, left, right, left here. I'm going off my right and landing on my left and decelerating. So remember, when I said that closed chain, when you land on the ground, I need to then go through a flexion pattern. This pitcher needs to ultimately go through an extension pattern on his left leg. So then when he lands on the ground, he then can go through the triple flexion pattern on his left leg to decelerate, to absorb his forces. And so looking at human movement, this one's a little bit different than ambulation, than walking. But understanding that both hips are doing the same thing. One is extending, extending, rotating, while the other is extending, extending, rotating, moving towards home plate. And we see that right here. Okay. And you have to do that because the left leg isn't going to drive again. It's just going to absorb. It's going to stop the body. So that's critical. So the examples we looked at earlier, we were looking at more or less the body ambulating, going up the stairs, running down the field. This pitcher, the right leg is in extension, external rotation. So you look at, you got plantar flexion at the foot, the right leg. You got extension at the knee. You got hip extension, external rotation. From there, the left leg is also extended with plantar flexion. You see the toe being down. Once it lands on the ground, it's going to immediately go into a flexion pattern. So I go to deliver the body, and there's your flexion pattern. That is dorsiflexion on the right. That is knee flexion. That is hip flexion, internal rotation. That is contralateral rotation of the right side of the body into the left knee. And the shoulders, we start to look at how the body moves there. If we look at that absorption pattern, if you didn't extend the left leg and actually rotate it in the stride phase, when you're striding, when you're going to foot plant, you wouldn't be able to absorb over your lead hip. That would be a big time mechanical flaw, and it'd be something that the pitcher would have to work on inside of their movement dysfunction inside the gym with the performance coaches to get that better. So ultimately they could improve their pitching mechanics. So we look at that. We can look at the same thing inside of hitting. Same thing. We're actually not going to ambulate. We're going to create force and then we're going to stop. And so understand that the two sides of the body have to go through a flexion extension pattern. One, the right leg here is in a flexion pattern. We're loading the body so then we can propulse. We can drive the body towards the pitcher or up in the box so we can create that rotational force to hit the baseball. But also that left leg is going to have to go into a little bit of extension, external rotation, so then I can decelerate the body in flexion, internal rotation. So we go to toe touch. So I have stride. If you look at the athlete right there, the right leg is starting to plantar flex. The knee is extended. The hip is flexed and internally rotated, but it's starting to move, right? The hip is now going to start to turn. The directionality of the torso right now with the hip flexed a little bit is towards the catcher, but in just a second, the directionality is going to go to the opposite side, which is going to be the flexion rotation side of the body. So we're just going to do swap spaces or switch sides. So at toe touch, the heel goes down. We immediately start this cascading of effects of hips, torso, shoulders, contact. The hips move. You start to see that the pelvis move. It rotates around. The left hip is now internally rotated. It's flexed and internally rotating the joint. Okay. The foot is plantar flexed, and you now have, dorsiflexed, and you now have that internal rotation of the hip. You can see that the left foot there on the ground. okay? And then the directionality, the torso, the sternum is now rotating towards the left, which would be your flexion rotation pattern. And so all I'm showing is the body goes through these same patterns over and over again. And inside there, if there's something dysfunctional inside that pattern, if you lack range of motion in your ankle or your knee or your hips or your torso, ultimately something's going to break down. And a lot of times you see that with a hitter here is with that left foot. That left foot needs to stay closed, okay? It needs to stay closed to provide a block. That block creates a whip, okay? So when your body rotates, when that pelvis rotates around, if that foot is firm in the ground, your pelvis is going to stop just for an instant. It's going to pass that speed onto your torso. Your torso is going to rotate. It's going to pass that speed onto your shoulders. Your shoulders are going to rotate. It's going to pass that speed onto the back, and the resultant velocity of the back is way faster than just the rotation of your hip. But if that lead hip, that left hip lacks flexion or internal rotation, lacks the prerequisite movement pattern, then what will happen is that foot will spin. That foot will land open. And if it opens, it doesn't block. It doesn't stop your hips. So your hips keep moving. Ultimately, that doesn't culminate in the proper kinetic linking sequence. It disrupts the harmony of the movement, which ultimately disrupts the ability to create force at impact of the ball. We're going to talk about pitching mechanics, okay? And this is from Florida Baseball Ranch or Texas Baseball Ranch and looking at their 7 attractors in pitching. And I use that just because there's different positions that the body has to be in to have success in throwing the baseball, right? In pitching or delivering or executing the pitch or delivering with any efficacy or any success. And we're going to look at number 1, right? A lot of times the movement deficiency that you'll see is quad dominant. You'll see a pitcher that doesn't have the ability to, as the pitching range we talk about is number 1, co-contraction of the back, hip, knee, ankle, just prior to first forward move. So when you're going to load the body, you're going to go into that triple flexion, right? You have that dorsiflexion, that knee flexion, that flexion, internal rotation of the right hip. And then immediately, once you're there, you're now going to change positions and you're not going to drive. You're going to go into the extension rotation pattern. And in there, if somebody has an inability to what we'll say is feed in, so load into that right hip, then all of a sudden somebody will become what they'll call quad dominant. And they'll become more of a flexion extension pattern. They'll stand more upright and they'll use just their quad and their knee to try to perform this function. And it results in disharmony. It results in inefficient movement. It results in a movement compensation. Whatever term you want to use, it will ultimately result in a pitching mechanical flaw and possibly lead towards future injury. So looking at that, we're going to kind of work off that feed in to the right hip or feed into the hip position that somebody would be in what we'll call this position 1 of the 7 attractors in pitching, so quad dominant. So going back to my original conversation, I said this comes from working with pitching coaches and talking with them and talking about, is it the drill or do I need to build a better robot? What is it? I don't know. Sometimes the drill works and sometimes the drill doesn't work and the coach gives them another drill or gives them another verbal cue. And sometimes the coach is limited. They don't know what to do. They don't know what the resources are. They don't know that it's a movement dysfunction that is causing the performance flaw. And so I want to start to kind of present an idea of where you might look or where you might see these things start to show up. So I want to change your mindset towards movement dysfunction. And so inside of our performance, we're always looking at the performance pyramid. All of our performance kind of fits inside of this. It was originally set up by Gray Cook. And you start to look at this foundation to performance in your sport or your skill. And we start to look at foundation, and we always talked about, well, that's your movement patterns. That's your ability to squat. That's your ability to lunge. That's your ability, your stability, your mobility, your FMS movement patterns, right? And that is the building blocks to build on to continue to build a better athlete. And then performance is strength, power, it's endurance, it's all the things that we do, the sexy stuff we do inside the performance facility, inside the gym. And then skill. We, of course, we're always talking about the bottom 2 pieces are what we're doing as a profession to provide a better athlete or a better product for the coach to work with to refine and develop their skill. And so we live in those bottom two pieces, and the coach lives in the top area, which is skill. So if I break down the bottom two pieces, right, I start to look at how do I talk about foundation to performance in your skill or in your sport. And a lot of times we'll break this down into this tech model. In this, what is the optimal? We'll talk about position, pattern, and power. We'll talk about position, mobility and stability of each individual joint, right? Each joint has to have a certain range of motion to be able to express, to then play a part in the next joint's ability to express its range of motion, for the next joint to express its ability of range of motion, to then create a pattern. What do you mean? Well, we talked about hitting just for a second, right? And I talked about that lead hip on that hitter, that right-handed hitter and that left hip. If that left hip lacks some mobility, lacks the ability to internally rotate, that's going to affect the position of the foot at the ground and the knee at contact, which is ultimately going to affect the pattern, which is the ability to rotate over that lead leg, over that hip, the torso, the shoulders, and the back, which is ultimately going to affect the ability for that athlete to express their strength qualities or power at contact. And so we call that energy leak, you call it compensation. But when I start to look at it, there's a way to assess that. There's a way to look at that. There's a way to say that player lacks internal rotation at that lead hip, so he's not going to be able to get in the position you need. So then when we're moving from launch pattern or launch to toe touch to actual attack the baseball, that pattern is going to be off. We know that from the get-go because that person lacks a certain ability with his lead hip to be able to get in that position. So this is where we start to look at these two things and we start to say, these things fit together now. The position, pattern, power sits inside of that foundation and performance. And I kind of look at pattern a little bit, that it could straddle that line a little bit more than power. But ultimately, foundation performance in our terms is now position, pattern, power. So I got to find the movement prerequisites of each position of each joint that make meaningful shapes. I then need to look at patterns and be able to move from shape to shape, pattern to pattern. So move from the ability to come in my stance leg, the ability to then move towards home plate, the ability then to drive the baseball towards home and get over and decel. Power is then the ability to express those with the optimal force, speed, angles that are represented. So looking at assessment, we do the SFMA with athletes inside of our facilities. And this is only one example of portions of it. I'm not trying to teach you an assessment here. I'm trying to teach you a mindset. And that mindset is starting to say, well, if I'm working with a pitcher and that pitcher has an inability to load into that back leg, they are quad dominant. I need to understand why they're quad dominant. It could be that their hip can't get into the optimal position for me to be able to go into that triple flexion or that flexion rotation pattern. And let's stick with the right-handed pitcher, right? So their inability to flex through their right leg, turn their sternum to the right to load, prior to then going to the extension rotation left pattern to deliver the baseball. So looking at this, if I took an athlete and I said, stand in front of me, and I said, put your feet together and just turn and look over your right shoulder and look over your left shoulder. Number one, I want to see symmetry. I want to see a similar pattern right to left. Now, there is a certain degree that we want to get to. We ultimately want to see that right shoulder get past the 90-degree part, the middle of their body. But I want to see symmetry. I want to see the body move in unison. I don't want to see something bend or the right look different than the left when they move. And so as a coach, I'm just saying, let's have a mindset of looking at how this all works in a harmonic or symbiotic sequencing. So looking at this, as I rotate to the right, I'm looking for the feet and the knees and the hip and the torso and the shoulders and the head. And then I have them rotate the opposite way, which if we think about this, these are the same patterns we're talking about, which is flexion, rotation right, or extension, rotation left. Okay, and inside here, then I rotate back to the left, and I want to see that there's symmetry there. Now, if I take the body and I sit down, I'm now going for multiple layers, from the foot and ankle to the knee, to the hips, to the low back, to the torso, to the shoulders, to the neck. I'm taking that away. Now I'm sitting them down, and now I have a little bit of the hips, the low back, the torso, the shoulders, and the head. And now I'm looking for, where does the pattern break down? So understanding that if I see the pattern break down where they're standing, that might be indicative of something taking place in the lower body, possibly. We don't know, there's plenty of places to look, but this is the mindset here. Then the body sits down, and we do that same rotation to the right, and we look for symmetry. Once again, there's a certain prerequisite. We'll see in the future slides what are kind of the degrees that we're looking for, but we're looking for the shoulders to create the same range of motion, both right to left. So now we rotate to the right and we rotate to the left. Now, if we think about a pitcher for a second, that right-handed pitcher, sticking with a right-handed pitcher, that right-handed pitcher is always going to be rotating left, rotating left, rotating left. Yes, they rotate right to get to load that side, to take the ball out of the glove, to get into external rotation, to get into that cocking phase. But ultimately, they're going to go through a more exaggerated rotation left, over and over and over and over and over. And ultimately, possibly, that body could get into propensity to rotate left. And so then they lose the ability to rotate right. And so all of a sudden, you see somebody that they have quad dominance of their right leg, and you're seeing them not being able to feed into that right hip. We ultimately need to possibly get the body to learn how to rotate right again, because they've always rotated left as they're delivering the baseball. Now, inside here, as I break it down, you're starting to basically eliminate pieces. So standing up, multiple layers, sitting down, less layers. Now, if I see it break down, this possibly could be in the torso. It possibly could be in the shoulders, the inability to rotate. So then we go to the suspended position. And in the suspended position, my body is no longer stacked, and it's having to fight gravity. So looking at somebody in the middle picture, as I rotate to the right, let's say I look good there, right? Everything rotates right, rotates left. Understand gravity's on my side, the body's naturally stacked, the spine is in its optimal position. Now when I go to this flexed position, where my torso is flexed over and my forearm is on the floor, my other hand is behind my back, gravity comes into play. So now this stability, the ability for my body to actually move through the range of motion, the ability to fight gravity and rotate into that side or feed in to that left hip there. If all of a sudden I see some dysfunction there, that athlete's directionality of the directionality left here would have some dysfunction in more of a stability sense, quite possible. I'm going to test bilateral. I want to look at symmetry. But remember, that right-handed pitcher that's always going left could possibly have some dysfunction moving right. So we want to look at now joint by joint. And this is not to say you got to be an expert, you got to get your goniometer, but understand that in order to produce the positions that we're looking for and the patterns that we're looking for to then represent the powerful kinetic linking rotational forces that we need to pitch, we ultimately need these joint by joint positions to be able to then get in the patterns we want. If somebody's lacking these range of motions, that's going to ultimately culminate in a movement compensation or a mechanical flaw. So it's pretty common that people will talk about closed chain dorsiflexion needs to be 40 degrees. So the ability to sit on, or kneel, half kneel on the ground and allow your knee to translate or shin to tilt or lean forward is where you'll see 40 degrees of dorsiflexion. You then start to see flexion extension. Extension, of course, should be 0. Some people are greater. You'll see when delivering the baseball, this is kind of an aside. Same with the right-handed pitcher, the left leg when you're delivering the baseball, some people have the knee slightly flexed. Some people will go into some type of extension or hyperextension when they go to ball release, but that extension should be 0. And then flexion, 130 degrees, and we're looking for that ability to remember, to load, to go into triple flexion, the ability to create force. Now, inside here, we have the hips, and we start to look at, we have hip flexion, about 120 degrees, extension, the hip actually goes past the body a little bit, you know, plus or minus 10 degrees. Active straight leg raise, so laying on the back, raising one leg up, you should get to about 80 degrees of active mobility, and understand that that takes stability. The ability for me to lay on my back and bring one leg up in the air while keeping the other leg down to 80 degrees takes some expression of stability of my torso, of my hips, and mobility of my hamstrings, not just having tight hamstrings. And then you have your femoral IR and ER, internal rotation and external rotation. And internal rotation, about 30 degrees, external rotation, about 45 degrees, and understanding that as the shin moves in front of you, understand that a lot of times when it moves, what you would think external rotation is internal rotation of your hip, or when it moves towards midline, you would think that's internal rotation. It's actually external rotation of your hip. So that can be tricky. You know, and that's why you got to be able to understand that and see that, and then if you were able to change the position of the body, understand what that is going to internal and external rotation at the hip. Now, the lumbar spine is a stable area. We want it to be a little bit more stable, but it still gives you a little bit of rotation, right? Plus or minus about 30 degrees. The thoracic spine gives about 50 degrees. So if we now take about our hips, internal and external rotation, the internal rotation about 35 degrees, the lower back about 30 degrees, so at 65 degrees, and then the 50 degrees in my torso is now 115 degrees. What I say in that picture when I was standing with my feet together, I wanted not only symmetry, I wanted the body to move from the feet to the knees to the hips to the torso to the shoulders in unison, not with any breakdown. I wanted it to be equal bilaterally, but also I said to get past midline. And why would it get past midline? Well, understand that if my hips are expressing their range of motion, my low back is expressing its range of motion, and my mid-back or thoracic spine is expressing its range of motion, the total there is about 115 degrees, which would get me past midline. And then you have your shoulder, you have your flexion, extension, and internal and external rotation, and looking at optimal movement patterns there. I'm really focusing on right now the torso and the hips, and so we won't dive too much into the shoulders there. And then the neck, 80 degrees of rotation right to left. So understanding that getting the ability to look right to left to where my chin lines up with my clavicle. Now, looking at the picture on the right, and we start to look at these fascial slings, because if we only look at the joint by joint approach, we neglect something. We neglect that the body is not just joints, but it's muscles, it's connective tissue, it's fascial lines that allow you to create locomotion or create force. And inside those fascial lines, they work together. And so this is just a schematic to start to create some of the fascial lines, maybe like the posterior oblique sling. Like if I pull this away, the posterior oblique sling from right shoulder to left hip, understanding what kind of role that plays with your right lat and your left, your thoracolumbar junction and your left glute, looking at your posterior superficial line, looking at some of these lines, these fascial lines of the body and how they come into play, understanding that the joints play a role, but the muscles that are connected to the bones, that are connected to the connective tissue, that's connected to the fascial line, is how we actually move. And so dysfunction inside those fascial lines will ultimately result in a dysfunctional pattern. So let's look at correcting movement dysfunction. Let's look at this kind of system to how we can go about. If I see something that breaks down, so I go and take that picture and I see something going on where they can't feed into that back hip and they are quad dominant. So I'm going to say, hey, for just a second, I want you to stand with your feet together and I want you to turn to your right and turn to your left. Wow, that looks pretty good. That looks pretty symmetrical. Okay, great. Let's have you sit down. Rotate right, rotate left. Oh, rotate right was really off. It seems compromised, but rotate left looks pretty good. Rotation right is compromised. And then we say, let's go ahead and go to that suspended position, and we rotate right, and it's still compromised. Understand that, remember, one was stacked with my gravity helping my spine and my range of motion, and one was suspended where gravity comes into play and my spine now has to actually work from segment to segment. And so I start to see that and I say, okay, I see something that's wrong, but now what do I do to fix it? And so I'm going to give you the algorithm inside the position pattern power to start to fix it. I'm also going to start to show some general things. It's not a specific plan for one person. It's an overarching system or plan that you then can start to implement and make up your own drills, make up your own soft tissue work, make up your own patterning drills to ultimately correct the dysfunction, right? And so we start to look at position. And in that pyramid that we showed earlier, we talked about position, pattern, power. And we talked about position. And these are the body's ability to express a certain range of motion joint by joint. And we know inside of, we want to take the body and we want to give it what we'll call a restorative input. We want the body to say, hey, well, I'm going to do something here. We're going to make a change. So we go in and we do some type of trigger point, we do some type of med ball, we do some type of foam rolling to that tissue, to that area, bring some oxygen there, bring some blood flow there, start to warm it up. But once again, telling the nervous system and the brain, hey, we're going to make a change here. We're going to do something to this system. So that person that can't rotate right, it could be caused by a dysfunction of their shoulder girdle. It could be caused by a dysfunction of their lat length, right? That ability to extend and actually rotate. It could be caused by the thoracic spine's inability to rotate or extend. And so looking at this, we're going into those areas saying, all right, so if the flexion rotation pattern has a dysfunction, what could cause it? That could be caused by that posterior shoulder lacking the range of motion. It could be by the lat lacking its range of motion. It could be caused by the paraspinals. We also could start to now work down the chain, right? We start to look downward. We start to look what's taking place below the torso, and we start to say, okay, it could be the TFL. That TFL restriction, it could be all of a sudden that taking your internal rotation and compromising it. You're now severely external rotating, you lack internal rotation because that TFL is so tight. And we got to go ahead and start to say, we're going to make a change here. We're going to open this hip up a little bit. You can go to your glutes and you could say, we're going to make a change here. And so we put a restorative input into those glutes with a trigger point ball, med ball, foam roller, whatever you're going to use. And then you go into your adductors and you start to play a role inside of how the torso or how the lower body moves with conjunction with the pelvis and the torso. So following that restorative input, that's soft tissue work, we're going to spend a little time there, but then we need to now get into the mobility, right? So we start to say position is still working on soft tissue, now mobility. We now need to teach it a new range of motion. We need to open it up. We need to encourage it to move in the direction that we want. And when I use these terms, multiple layers, and then you'll see less layers and then the least amount of layers, I'm trying to show how you can isolate. So these drills could be a lot of things going on. So when I mean a lot of things going on, go back to the person standing, right? If I am standing, I'm going to rotate right. My ankles, my knees, my hips, my low back, my torso, everything's got to have the right range of motion to work in concert to be able to express that range of motion. That's multiple layers. So inside these drills, you'll see I'm trying to break them down into something that's very complex and then get a little bit more isolated. And inside of here, some of these things will also overlap, right? You'll see some of the drills sit in both places because they're very common. These shapes are the same. So if we look at these three shapes here and we start talking about multiple layers, we start to look at what's taking place. The right leg of the first picture, the glute with reach, the right leg is flexed into the rotated. The directionality of the torso is right. I'm rotating to the right. I'm reaching to the right. And so now I'm encouraging flexion and rotation right. Extension on the left leg, right? I'm expressing the ability to rotate my torso, which is going to lengthen that left lat, is going to change the directionality to the right. There's a lot of things going on there. You look at shin box with rotation, same thing going on. That right leg is expressing flexion into rotation as that pelvis rotates onto that femur. The left leg is extended, externally rotate, right? Externally rotated. The torso is rotating around. My lat is starting to extend to come around. Remember, that would be the one that would be on the front side when I'm running. Then we go back to the bretzel. So you start to look at the same thing, the directionality of the torso and the leg, as you start to go at flexion, internal rotation with the directionality towards that lead leg. The sternum is rotated contralaterally. It's rotated towards the left side that's across my body. So inside here, multiple layers. This is working a lot of things. This is if you only had one or two exercises to do, this is a big bang for your buck. If you really know where you're hunting, then all of a sudden you're going to have to break it down into less layers and less layers to go after one maybe dysfunctional area to then link it back together. So if we then went less layers and we said, let's go less layers and focus on the upper quarter. Now this is where you start to see some of the overlap. There's shin box rotation again. But ultimately in this shin box rotation, I can really focus on the torso rotating here. I'm using that right hand as a fulcrum or a pivot point so I can push into that turn. I can push my body around as I'm reaching with my left arm, and I'm really encouraging that T-spine to rotate. If you look at the one in the middle, the single leg adduction rotation, you now are working in the flexion extension pattern of the left leg. And then you could take that right arm and thread that through. That would be kind of more layers. But inside of less layers, here's that lat extension, the ability for the torso express extension as you go in that flexion pattern. The 90-90 with punch, we're holding our lower body steady with that blue pad so it's not moving. So we're focusing on the lumbar spine, the thoracic spine to create that rotation. And then we're even going to use that punch to work on a fascial line, to work on that anterior oblique sling to allow you to activate it to encourage that flexion pattern. Now, inside that rotation, these are less layers, but focused on the upper quarter. We then move down into the least layers. And you say, wait a minute, Russ, you said that the bretzel was the most layers. Yes, I did. And you said the 90-90 was less layers. I did. But understand, if I was focused on just the shoulder and the scapula, these could be two moves that I would take. I could also pick the bretzel for lower body. I could focus on the hip flexion, internal rotation, and extension, external rotation of the lower body. I could use that drill in that as well if that was my move that dysfunction. But this happens to be I'm focused on shoulder and scapula, so I could pick this exercise. Look at the 90-90 punch, great one. You're starting to go into open like a book, so that left arm rotates towards the sky. The left arm then will punch up to encourage that rotational pattern of the T-spine. Inside that 90-90 arm bar, you're actually using that kettlebell to give me a little assist into that rotation. So I'm rotating to create that T-spine rotation with a little encouragement from the kettlebell. I'm coming back around for a little bit of stability if I go into a sideline arm bar there. So I'm killing two birds with one stone. I'm talking about mobility here, and this is an active assisted mobility stretch, but also it's also going to turn around when I go and press that kettlebell up in the sky into a stability exercise. So when you're time crunched, right? When you're time crunched, you use these exercises that give you more bang for your buck. If you know exactly what you're going for, what area you're going for, you need to isolate, use the least layers. If you're time crunched, use the most layers. So now we think about position, pattern, power. We've basically told the body what we want it to do, where we want it to be, right? We said, all right, you're lacking range of motion in your T-spine to allow you to feed into that right hip because you're right-handed pitcher and you're quad dominant. I've then gone and done a restorative input to that torso, that thoracic spine. I've then gone and done some 90-90 stretch. I've gone and done some things to then encourage that to open up and move in that direction. But then I need to teach the body stability. I need to teach the body stability at both ends, and then I also need to teach it how to move from end to end. So if we start to look at this first exercise where he's talking about multiple layers, the ability here in this T-hip rotation is a single leg RDL, but then you're going to open or externally rotate on your right hip. And so as you actually rotate your left leg is going to go to the sky. You're going to ultimately open your torso and look towards those boxes. And in that T-hip rotation, as I rotate, the T-spine has to hold posture because it's suspended. So it has to hold posture to be able to rotate fighting gravity. But I'm not just training my T-spine, I'm training my hips, I'm training my down leg, I'm training my hamstring, I'm training my upper leg in extension, my left hip, my left glute, on and on and on. Single leg stance with core activation, teaching the body how to now feed into that left leg. So teaching that T-spine, how to feed into that left leg and hold posture and stay tall through that right leg. You have this high split anti-rotation press. Now, understanding this, where that resistance is, that's a band in my hand that goes back to the wall. This is the third picture to the right. That band is at a horizontal, and it's even with where my hands are. I don't want it above or below through this exercise. And I want to take my sternum, my knee, and then ball my foot or my midfoot need to be in alignment. That allows me to put the proper forces on the body. And then I'm going to try to resist the band wants to pull me into, wants to feed me into that left hip, and I'm going to fight that. Understanding that when somebody goes to load in that position one for pitching, they got to get to that position, but they also have to fight. They have to be able to get to the position, hold posture, and then come out of that position. If they can't dynamically stabilize in that position, they're still going to have problems. And so this one's kind of teaching that dynamic stability of triple flexion when you're going into that flexion rotation pattern. We then look at left layers, stability-wise. We now have taken the lower body, we've taken the lower body out a little bit. So now we have that anti-rotation press to where this is more torso involvement. Yes, a little bit of that hip as it's on the down leg in the anti-rotation press, but same thing. You got a band, it's at your chest, you're pressing outward, but really now focused on what the torso is doing on the pelvis. You look at the stability push-pull, using two cables, one in the front, one in the back, holding posture into a more of an extended position, push-pull. So less layers, body's holding position, upper body is moving inside of a a rotation pattern. Kettlebell assisted rotation, you look at this, less layers, you now say that kettlebell is going to give me a core assist, but it's also going to allow my body to self-organize. Understanding that what each joint or each segment needs to do, that kettlebell helps my body find neutral to allow me then to rotate on a center axis. You'll see somebody that doesn't have that will contort and rotate inside of the range of motion that they have. If you give them the kettlebell, they'll stack up, they'll self-organize in a joint by joint, and then they'll rotate over that center axis a little bit or better because they're respecting that weight. You then look at position stability, least layers, and you say, okay, let's look at this core assisted single leg lowering. I talked about that active straight leg raise and being able to express 80 degrees plus or minus. The ability for, I said that it takes not only mobility of your hamstring or your posterior chain, but also stability to express that mobility. So this exercise allows you to turn on the core assist or turn on the core to allow your pelvis to be stable for you then to express that range of motion. Inside of the feeding in, if somebody had the inability to hold posture, they're not going to be able to feed into their back hip. They're not going to be able to express their range of motion because they can't hold posture. This would be a good drill for that. DNS star is a great one when you start talking about shoulder scapula. It's a very complex exercise. This has a band wrapped around the body. The band is wrapping the body that's going to basically pull you into that down hip. So the band wraps from the right shoulder, goes around the back like the posterior oblique sling, and then sits underneath the bottom hip. That's going to force you into flexion, which is going to then encourage you to extend out. So it's going to force you into a little bit of a flexion rotation pattern, which makes you extend and rotate out, which is exactly a global movement theme. And then finally, kettlebell assist, where you start to look at the ability for the torso to hold posture. Sometimes we'll do this on a foam roller. Sometimes we'll do it flat on the ground. But the ability for me to reach over and hold posture without or disassociate my upper body with my lower body is key to allowing me to express optimal patterning. So we now want to talk a little bit about pattern to power. And remember, inside that we went position, pattern, power. And why am I saying pattern to power? Because I said that a little bit of that pattern, orange bucket inside the pyramid could kind of play a little bit higher inside of foundation to performance. And so we start to look at patterning and power and how we're going to look at the same position and how I'm going to stabilize in that same position and then give the body the ability to move through that, create chaos, create a random environment, force the body to adapt, force the body to express what I'm looking for. Because in sport, in the skill that I'm wanting to express, it's not a controlled manner. There's changes, there's subtle changes. You get off balance, you land differently. different pitches and different situations and what's going on, you ultimately need to be able to express that movement pattern in a chaotic environment. So looking here at this chops, the first picture, this is the ability for me to feed in and feed out of that lead left hip in a flex pattern. And so ultimately, when the dowel goes back towards the machine, the direction on my sternum is now contralateral rotation towards that triple flex side, which is just running. And then as I go to express or quote unquote feed out, my foot is going to push in the ground like that closed chain activity I was talking about, where it's going to turn into, it's not going to move, but it's going to turn into an extension pattern. It wants to push, it wants to plantarflex. The knee wants to extend, the hip wants to start to extend and externally rotate so I can create force to move in the opposite direction. The only difference here is I'm not going to move my lower body. I'm just going to move my upper body to allow my shoulders to toggle a little bit to work on the directionality around that stable pelvis. And then I can do the same thing to feed into my right hip. So somebody has an inability, has quad dominant, this reverse lunge with rotation is awesome. The ability to reverse lunge and use the directionality of the shoulders and the sternum to feed in to that right glute. You've now created that same pattern that is triple flexion rotation or flexion rotation that's forcing the athlete to then express that and then turning it back around, reciprocating into the extension rotation in the opposite direction, like delivering the baseball towards home plate. And then lateral bound with med ball, same position now, but dynamically. Jump into it, hop into it, bound into it. So then all of a sudden the body's got to absorb those forces and then create forces out of it in the opposite direction, very similar to mechanics. We then have rotational push-pull. So we have less layers. So the last one incorporated a lot. Now we're a little bit more static, a little bit less movement going on. We have rotational push-pull. This person is loading it, and so flexion rotation left, and then going to extension rotation right, but in a little more controlled manner. The lateral lunge, instead of moving, you're lunging, you're just moving out and back, is not as dynamic. And then this perpendicular med ball toss is you're in this high split position. Remember, midfoot, knee, sternum, all in alignment, and then deliver the ball into the wall aggressively. Try to take yourself off balance and hold posture, making your lower body work in a dynamic stability sense to hold posture. So then when you're on the mound, you're going to load. If your torso moves and your knee and your hip all move, you don't have the ability to load that fascial line. So you now have the ability now to create stability in that left foot, allow the torso to move to load that fascial line to then come unwound to deliver the baseball. Looking at position and pattern here, release layers. We go back to the lifts and chops. We did chops earlier. Now we have lifts, a little bit less movement going on here. We start to look at the ability to now encourage the body with an eccentric load. As I'm taking that dowel back towards the machine, I'm not eccentrically loading, more of a decel, more of a load into that side like you would on the mound to feed into that hip. And then coming out, I'm feeding out as I'm driving that dowel with my left hand. Step up with a punch, same thing, dynamic control. Can I load into that hip and can I drive out dynamically with control from the ground all the way up to my shoulders? This one, I talk about this being least layers. We're really looking at, can the shoulders and the scapula do this? It's a lot harder exercise than it looks with a med ball overhead to be able to express that range of motion because the way the body's stacked and the length of the lines. And then the perpendicular med ball toss, as you start to go into a half kneeling position, making sure that that knee is tilted just slightly, and then you're going to dynamically move the torso over the static pelvis. Less moving parts, less things going on, but more scapular shoulder focus. So going back to what we've talked about today, and you start to look at introducing the global movement themes, introducing the body that it flexes and it rotates and it extends and it rotates and it oscillates between the two inside of human movement. And then taking that and applying it into baseball, both hitting and pitching. I really want to talk a little bit more about pitching and only one movement flaw. We could cover all the movement flaws inside of the movement patterns, inside of the global movement theme. But looking at just quad dominance and the inability to load that back hip and feed in on that post leg to then go and deliver the baseball to home or to the catcher. And so then we talked a little bit about assessment. We talked a little bit about how we look at the body from the ground up, and then how we could chop it. And we could say, okay, we looked at from the ground up, let's sit down and just look at the top half, and let's look at it in a suspended sense and see what might break down, mobility, stability sense. And then we evaluated and said, what does it need to be joint by joint to express those range of motions? And if I'm missing those pieces, I ultimately need to attack that. I need to go and clean that up so we know that we can then express the optimal shape that we're trying to make. And inside that, we started to look at saying, why is the pitching coach sometimes right and why is the performance coach sometimes right? And we understand that inside, if I can meet the prerequisites and somebody gives me a drill, I can clean it up with a verbal command or a drill. But ultimately, if I'm missing any of those prerequisites, position, pattern, or power, all the skills, all the drills, all the coaching cues are going to not result in a change. Because ultimately, we got to go back to the system and make a change to result in higher output or higher performance. And then finally, we took that and we said, okay, what do we do with all that? And we set up a framework of position, pattern, power. In position, we did soft tissue and some mobility work. We then did some stability work. We then started to pattern the body, and I linked pattern and power together. And that pattern and that power working together is the ability to first stabilize and move from shape A to shape B, and then start to increase the force and the speed, and then increase finally the chaos and the power output. So we're starting to work this continuum to result in better movement to allow them to go back and translate that into pitching or hitting or whatever sport that you're trying to perfect with them. So I thank you for joining me today. I appreciate you spending the time and taking the time to learn more about the global movement themes. I look forward to seeing you next time.